This is a dramatized, narrative-style retelling created for entertainment by Turkish Spotlight Secrets. It is not a statement of fact about any real person. With that said, here is how the storm looked from the outside, as the industry held its breath. The tension around Gökberk Yildirim had been building like thunder behind closed doors, a pressure system that only grew heavier with each day of silence. Weeks passed without a word from him. Rumors swelled, whispers stacked on whispers, and every sighting, every photo, every half-heard fragment turned into another brick in the wall of speculation. Then, after an almost eerie quiet, his voice finally reached the public. He didn't appear on a glossy stage or behind a podium, he spoke in a dim, controlled setting, the kind of room where sound carries but doesn't echo, where truth feels like the only thing that can live. His voice trembled, just enough to betray the weight on his chest. And he began with a sentence that sounded like a door unlocking. This is the hardest moment I've had to face, and I can't keep stepping around it anymore. He didn't rush. He didn't dramatize. But the gravity in his tone said everything. This wasn't a publicity beat. This wasn't a tease. It was a fracture line running through a carefully managed life, and he was finally admitting it was real. Insiders had already been sounding the alarm. The push and pull had started when his former partner, Cemre Arda, began speaking with a rawness that made every camera lean closer. Her interviews sprang up without pattern, here one night, there the next afternoon, each appearance threaded with emotion and underscored by statements that felt like open veins. One moment fiery and unfiltered, the next wounded and wistful, she seemed to ricochet between past and present like she was trapped in both. Those close to the situation said the unpredictability pressed hard on him. It cornered him. Not with accusations alone, but with the sensation of unfinished business made public. What came next startled even those who thought they had mapped out every possible turn. Overwhelmed by unanswered questions and the hammering beat of public doubt, Gökberk made a choice he had long avoided. He requested a DNA test regarding the child at the center of Cemre's claims. It was a sentence repeated in hushed tones across studios and sets, a line that made journalists straighten in their chairs and made friends close ranks. The entertainment world called it emotionally brutal. Behind this decision was a man who had run out of rooms to hide in and stories to tell himself. He told us he felt ripped in two, one close friend confided later, eyes rimmed with the uneasy loyalty of someone who never expected to be speaking at all. He kept saying, I'm shattered as a father, but I need the real answer, for me, for my family, and for that child, whoever he is to me. It wasn't said out of anger. It was said with the kind of exhaustion you only hear when love and fear have been fighting a long time. As for Cemre, the why behind her escalating emotion remained a riddle nobody could solve. Observers trained their lenses on the possibility of old wounds resurfacing with a vengeance, of guilt and unresolved tenderness clashing inside someone who doesn't easily let go. Others, perhaps colder, speculated there was a strategy at play, timing, messaging, carefully chosen platforms. But whether it was heart or calculation, one truth refused to budge: for Gökberk, everything had shifted. The floor he was standing on had a crack now, and it ran down the middle of his life. The questions ballooned almost instantly, like a crowd pressing forward to see what might break next. When would the test be completed? Were they already at a private clinic, or still negotiating terms no one would admit to? Would the results be clean and decisive, or would they open more doors than they closed? And what would any of it mean for him tomorrow, for the roles lined up on the horizon, for the brand he had built one careful step at a time? Fans of Kuma. The series that first ignited his rise and turned his name into a promise, latched onto every rumor like a live wire. They rewound interviews for hints. They analyzed posture and phrasing and inflection. They knew the public face, the effortless charm and the tender gravity that made him magnetic on screen. But this was different. This was an unguarded version, the side that rarely ventured into the light. And with each syllable he spoke, social media cracked like ice. Clips flooded feeds. Edits multiplied. The confession, gentle and steady, positioned him not as a star pleading a case but as a man pleading with his own fate. That's when the temperature rose even higher. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a revelation. It was something less visible and more dangerous, a thickening of the air. Messages appeared on platforms with the velocity of a downpour, supportive, skeptical, enraged, prayerful. Anonymous sources emerged. Old photos resurfaced with captions very clearly not written when the photos were taken. Agencies and publicists issued statements so carefully worded they felt like choreography. And through it all, the timeline only got blurrier. People tried to reconstruct the beginning. They asked when Gökberk and Cemre had fallen into the kind of rhythm that looks like love to those watching from the sidewalk. They remembered seeing them at events. Her dress softly catching light, his hand steady on her back, laughter shared with that intimacy that doesn't need an audience. They catalogued glances, weekends, stray mentions in interviews. Did everything make sense in retrospect? Had they missed the signs? Or were they now inventing signs to match a story that begged for order? Meanwhile, practical things were in motion behind the curtain. The test, which had become a ghost everyone was chasing, required quiet logistics. Doctors who would never talk, an appointment at a clinic that mostly served politicians and executives, sworn secrecy folded into confidentiality agreements. A law firm took over certain communications, their letters crisp and neutral and terrified of adjectives. And somewhere in the center of the city, a small waiting room continued to be what waiting rooms always are, a place where time slows enough to turn seconds into mirrors. In the narrative that formed around them, Cemre's posture shifted by the hour. At times, she seemed like a woman trying to find the shore after a storm, her words rough but honest, shaking under their own truth. At other moments, she moved like someone navigating a chessboard with more pieces than she could hold, countering and recalculating while the world tried to guess her endgame. What wasn't up for debate was the fact that she had become the eye of the hurricane. Still, intense, and watched by everyone. And then there was the child, the center of this orbit yet shielded by the limits of what society will accept being said aloud. Even those who spoke harshly softened when they reached that point in the conversation. Whatever the test said, a life would be marked by it. Whatever the result, two people would be forced to decide who they were going to be, and what they were going to owe, when the speculation finally met the truth. Industry veterans, tired enough to be blunt, called it a breaking point for both of them. They talked about reputation as if it were a delicate instrument that had to be tuned daily. They spoke of the economics and the empathy, of the schedules already printed, the scripts marked in pencil, the campaigns waiting in line with politely worded emails. So much of celebrity is math. This was not math. This was a heart problem. In private, those around Gökberk noticed a different cadence in him. He no longer rushed through rooms. He listened longer than he spoke. He put his phone face down and stared into the middle distance, as if the answer might be written there in a language he had yet to learn. Whether he was born to be a father or had learned to be one over time didn't matter. The idea had found him. And ideas like that don't leave quietly. For Cemre, the tangled motivations people kept debating might have been no more than the casting of shadows on a wall. She had her own clock, her own hunger for closure, her own definition of justice. The emotional pitch that made some label her as unpredictable might have been no more than someone refusing to compress her feelings into neat squares. But in this world, every octave is measured, and every tear is a headline. No one is allowed to simply feel. They must also explain, and then apologize for the explanation. And still, the questions looped: when does the test finish processing? Would it arrive as a sealed envelope, as a phone call, as a lawyer's email, as a cold PDF that could end an argument in one sentence and start another in the same breath? Would there be relief, or would clarity only make the pain louder? The clock kept moving. The city went about its chores, pretending not to be fascinated. The fans of Kuma, who first watched a younger version of him blaze across their screens, watched again now with a different kind of hunger. Not for the performance, but for the person. They remembered the quiet beats in his early scenes, those moments when he could convey 1,000 unsaid things just by standing still. They wondered if that talent had always come from this place, from a man who felt too much and finally had nowhere to hide it. Then, a whisper that turned into a rumor that turned into a headline: the test was either done or nearly done. The details changed depending on who spoke. Some said he arrived at dawn, hood up, escorted by two people who looked like shadows. Others swore she went first, composed and determined, choosing a slot that would entangle no passerby. None of that could be confirmed. But the certainty that something irreversible had begun was enough to set off the next wave. Friends braced. Families closed ranks. The people who loved them prepared to love them harder, or more quietly, or at a distance, whatever would be required. The people who only knew them through screens prepared to be judges, jurors, counselors, poets. And in the spaces where statements are drafted and photos are cropped, choices were being made with delicate hands. What did it mean for tomorrow? If the result aligned with Cemre's claims, then a new chapter would open with terrifying clarity. If it did not, then the reckoning would take a different shape, no less heavy, no less real. Either way, the truth would reshape them. Time changes people, but truth changes the room they stand in. By nightfall, his original message, steady, definite, a line drawn softly rather than slammed down, had become the most shared clip of the day. People who didn't care about actors cared about this. People who never posted. The confession became a vessel carrying everyone's projection of love and loss and responsibility. He had opened the door, and now there was no closing it until the house had been walked through. And yet, as saturated as everything felt, the atmosphere still thickened. It didn't explode into chaos. It simply tightened. The kind of tightness you feel when you know the climax hasn't arrived. The world waited on a result that would be both an end and a beginning, a verdict and a question. Every hour added another layer of electricity, and every silence spoke louder than the declarations that came before. In that silence lived two people who had loved each other once, who were bound by memory and now perhaps by more, staring down a future that would not be negotiated by charm or eloquence, only by the proof waiting to be read in black and white. So the industry held its breath again. He had spoken. She had been heard. The test moved forward like a train you can't stop by wishing. And all anyone could do was ask the same questions in new ways, hoping the answers would arrive gently. When will the truth show its face? What will it ask of them? And when it does, who will they be on the other side of it? The night stretched long, and the storm, somehow, grew even more intense.